Welcome back. We are trying to digest the Trump presidency because it has started and it has started with a bang. If you're expecting an inaugural address full of very kind words and tall tales and reminiscing and idealism, well, you got an action plan like perhaps never before, more so than I've ever seen, of an inaugural address being used to state concrete policy actions from day one. Some of them, of course, will translate, others, it's more difficult to say so. But let's pick this up. We continue this telecast as we are. Andrea Lucidi joining us on the broadcast. Michael Kugelman is going to be with us. Elizabeth Lazarus joining us as well. I'm expecting a few other guests. So let me welcome Andrea and Michael Kugelman to get this off. It's been a heck of a day. Andrea, now what do you make of what has happened, and how do we assess the first day, the second day, the first week? Is it going to be a lot of explosive things, or is it just a lot of conversation? Eventually all presidencies get dragged down into the same slow snail's pace.
Hello, thank you for invitation. So, of course, this new time for the President Trump is very speedy for my perspective, because I'm a war correspondent based in Russia, and here the Russian media are starting today to speak about the possible negotiation for the Ukrainian conflict to do the new Trump presidency. And of course, it's really interesting for me to see that the Trump administration have declared that from some weeks, from some days, they are working on a possible call between the President Trump and Vladimir Putin about the Ukrainian conflict, and maybe that President Trump are considering the possibility to meet the President Putin in the near future.
Okay, so Andrea, from where you are sitting, how does this play out? Okay, so most people we've been speaking to say that U.S. funding to the tunes of billions of dollars to Ukraine is going to dry up. Now that might be replaced by the British, because UK Prime Minister has been there and he says no, we'll keep sending the money. Maybe the Germans and the French will also cough up, but US funding dries up. If the US funding dries up, is Zelensky in trouble?
Yeah, of course. This is the main fear of the Ukrainian presidential administration in this moment. But we saw that today Volodymyr Zelensky take congratulations with Donald Trump for the election and take the office. But of course, without the help of the US, Ukraine alone cannot continue the war. And we need to consider that the Ukrainian administration, the Ukrainian state, now it's completely depending on the financial aid from the US.
Okay, so now let me rephrase the question. If Zelensky and his administration are in trouble, does that necessarily equate to the fact that the Ukrainian people will feel abandoned and will be in trouble?
Yeah.
So it does. What would then, because there is no functioning democracy in Ukraine right now, but it's a country under siege, there's no doubt about it. The Russians ain't going to go anywhere any fast. So what would the Ukrainian people want? To continue the war? Winning the war is going to be tough. What is a reasonable solution?
From my point of view, the Ukrainian people want the peace, and unfortunately, the administration of Zelensky and Zelensky itself pretend to continue the war to the final victory, like he said. And this is a big trouble, not only for Ukraine as a nation, but especially for the people of Ukraine, because they are fighting the war right now. There is a conscription, there is a total mobilization, a full mobilization in Ukraine. And we all saw the video where the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian officer for the recruitment are going on the street and take men that are under military age. So
So, so
the main
what the bottom
sorry.
lines in this is the Ukrainian people have been suffering and dying. Russians have been dying. The rest of us either sitting on a chessboard or having a conversation. So let me have this complex one as we've had before. Michael Kugelman, now, is it your understanding and assessment, as has been with everybody I've spoken to since morning, that yes, in a sense, the majority of US billions going into Ukraine are now going to dry up?
Yeah, well, definitely, we'll see a reduction in that support. One of the main features of Trump's foreign policy is an aversion to any type of commitment to military support over a long-term period. Many of Trump's supporters say that he doesn't like to start wars and he likes to end wars. But I think in the case of Ukraine, yes, I mean his main objective will be to try to end the war. He wants to be seen as the leader that's able to end that war. So I think that he's going to try to call for diplomacy and a summit involving him and Putin and Zelensky. That could likely come. But in terms of the money and the funding, yes, I do imagine that he would want to push for
So,
significant reductions in that funding. But
Michael,
his main
practical
justification would
question.
be to end the war.
Practical
Yep.
question, Michael. We've just seen the UK Prime Minister there. He wasn't at the Trump inaugural, but he was in Ukraine just a few days ago. He's offering more funding and long-term committed funding. Every year he says, we will fund the Ukrainians. Can the Europeans make up the difference if need be?
They may try to, because certainly, I think that the NATO allies of the U.S., many of them would be very concerned about a decision on the part of the U.S. to drastically cut back funding. And clearly, because of geography, the European NATO partners could face significant risks if there are cutbacks in U.S. support to the Ukrainians without any type of process to end the war. And there could be some significant implications for the European allies. So, yeah, to answer your question, I would think that there would be some among the NATO partners in Europe that would look to pick up the gap. But I don't know the specific numbers, but the U.S. has provided a significant amount of military support to the Ukrainians, so it would be difficult to try to make up for that
Even
loss
that number
if Trump were to bring
is
that
not
down a
known
lot.
because the US Department of Defense doesn't seem to recall where it spent some of its billions. So, Michael, on a practical question, is it possible for a Donald Trump to convince Vladimir Putin to the very least go back to the status quo of a few years ago before this current war started?
Well, I mean, that may be what Trump would want to do, but I think it's very difficult to when it comes to someone like Putin. I think it's very difficult for anyone to try to convince him to do something like that. So I think that it would be a very hard sell for President Trump for sure. But again, this is someone that wants to be seen as the guy that is able to bring this war to closure. So he may want to give it the college try, but it certainly won't be easy. And the basic point here that we have to remember is that this notion of Trump playing the role of a third-party mediator to get the warring parties to end their war, it's only going to work if the belligerents themselves are prepared to be receptive to that third-party mediation. And I don't know if we're there yet.
All right, tough one. Stay with me. Let me get Elizabeth Laris into this conversation and try to pick it up before we look at the security issues that are taking place in the Middle East. Dr. Laris, let's look further afield, because a few years ago we were told that the entire global focus is now on the Indo-Pacific because the new threat was China and the Cold War had already begun. From tariffs to trade corridors, it is taking place. Then, of course, we've been consumed with the older Cold War of NATO versus Russia, of the Middle East for the last now several years. Does anything change in the Trump presidency?
I believe we will see some change because if you look at Senator Rubio's confirmation comments, a lot of it was China, China, China. And Trump's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy nominee, Elbridge Colby, is about China, China, China. So this might be the time where you actually see, the policy wonks really, really pushing the China ball. What it comes down to, though, is the United States going to spend more on military, particularly its Navy, build more ships. Certainly the United States is essentially going back to the Philippines, back to Clark and Subic Bay. There are key bases in Asia that the United States is increasing its presence, but we need ships. China has the world's largest Navy, and it is a peer competitor now. You talk with every admiral of the Navy, and they will say China's a peer competitor. So we have to make our military more muscular if it's really going to be about China, China, China.
Okay, I don't want to overplay the capacity of the Chinese Navy because a lot of the ships are the small ships. In terms of aircraft carrier fleets, it's still America that rules the roost. But in a pragmatic sense, Professor Laris, is there a reasonable understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, because if I say follow the money and the follow the money goes that, oh, if somebody is funding Hezbollah and Hamas, then we say, okay, Iran. But Iran has been under sanctions for all these decades. So where does Iran get the money from? Well, you'll find that $400 billion were given by the Chinese and the Russians combined. You can argue that the war in Ukraine is about damaging a Chinese ally, not just about Russia. Is the Cold War already on?
Oh yes, it most certainly is. Yes, China is funding a lot of initiatives, aggression around the world. Certainly, it's still propping up North Korea. It is sending arms and technology to Russia, and as you mentioned, Iran. It's expanding its bases into Latin America. It controls much of the Panama Canal, and it's making inroads into Africa. So it has a lot of money. China is certainly, no matter what, going to continue those initiatives. However, as you know, the growth of China's economy is slowing, and it's having its own economic problems. It may even go into a deflationary era. And so then that brings into question, how much money, how overexpanded or extended are they willing to become and still, fund all of these different initiatives?
Okay, Dr. Laris, so let me ask you a slightly tricky question, and there's no scientific answer, I understand, so it's your opinion. So if the Chinese are watching the Western funding of the war in Ukraine with a proxy, the Ukrainians fighting the war, but the arms, equipment and the funding is coming from the West, and they're watching this war between Russia and Ukraine, which is basically Russia versus the West, are they seeing a highly dedicated, competent, united West taking on the Russians? Is that going to dissuade them, given the fact that Russia has suffered, that they've suffered material and manpower losses, no doubt about it? Does this make a Xi Jinping or the others more confident of an adventurism in, I don't know, in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Straits, or does it dissuade him?
I think they could take a couple of messages. First, if you remember, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, there was not a united effort immediately. It wasn't until the Ukrainians surprised the West by fighting back as hard as they did. It's like Ukraine had to prove itself before the West, ponied up the money, and then it came almost in drips and drabs, right, in a lot of different stages. It was enough to keep Ukraine and Russia fighting, but not enough for Ukraine to win. So China is probably taking the message that if it's looking at Taiwan, first of all, you go in big or you go home, because Russia did not go in big enough to meet its aims. It wanted to take Kiev and all of Ukraine, and it got bogged down. Xi Jinping doesn't want to take that risk. So if he moves in the South China Sea or in Taiwan, it's going to be massive. And that's one. And then, yes, he wants to do it quickly before the West, which drags its heels very often, decides to get its act together. He wants it done by the time Western aid starts coming in.
So let me get Michael in on this. Michael, not at the risk of being alarmist, but are we closer to the Chinese thinking about something dramatic, or are we further away, maybe for domestic reasons, maybe because of a new presidency? What do you assess? Do we expect the Chinese to heat things up or cool things down?
Well, I think there's going to be some watching and waiting from Beijing's part, at least initially. I think it's very notable that Trump has picked a lot of very hawkish folks on China to join his cabinet. But I think that they are, in many cases, more hawkish than he is. I mean, he has very frequently, in recent years, professed his admiration for President Xi, and he, of course, had a phone call with Xi recently. He had, of course, invited him to his inauguration, and he has said that he wants to work with China in areas where it can work. And I think that if you look at how Trump looks at competition with China, he's very focused on the economic side of it. But I think when it comes to the broader strategic competition as well as the military competition, I think that's an area where Trump might be willing to think about slowing things down. You know, as I said before, he doesn't want to get dragged into, he doesn't want the US to get dragged into conflict with China or with anyone. And that suggests that he may be willing to try to look for ways
Okay, so
to
but
bring
Michael,
down
the
tension.
multi-trillion dollar question, of course, is do the Chinese want to push their luck or to be dragged into a conflict, or do you suspect that because of domestic issues, they are also more than happy to avoid it?
I mean, the Chinese have had a lot of setbacks in recent years, and with their economic stress, which has affected the Belt and Road Initiative, they've experienced a number of setbacks in an economic context. It does not appear to have convinced them to scale back on their military provocations, particularly in the South China Sea and near the Taiwan Strait. But I don't, I'm not an expert on China, so I won't speak too long on this, but I'll just say that I do think that we could expect to see the Chinese government sort of pull back for a little bit just to see what type of signals Trump sends out and go from there and not necessarily be in a position where they would want to do anything rash this early on.
All right, I want to touch upon a point. Professor Laris, a few weeks ago, the outgoing US President Joe Biden avoided the Presidential Medal of Freedom to George Soros. Now, this was a topic of conversation where I am sitting in New Delhi. George Soros is considered an individual who has been operating pretty openly inimical to India's interests, perhaps even propagating regime change in my country. Now, my question, and it's a reasonable one, is why would an administration in the United States want to have a difficult association with India? It's been so difficult in the last few months that I promise you we've made peace with the Chinese on our borders, which you wouldn't have thought was possible up until a few months ago. It's been that bad. We are promoting BRICS now. We've had a prime minister go to Moscow, keeping options open because it's been difficult. Why would a US administration want to torpedo associations with India at the fag end of a presidency?
Yeah, well, you know what? That's a mystery because a lot of people in the United States and in Europe were very disturbed that President Biden awarded that Medal of Freedom to George Soros. He gloated over busting the Bank of England, of destroying the Malaysian economy. He gloated about influencing elections for district attorneys in the US who favored no cash bail and releasing criminals, murderers, rapists, thugs into American cities. And so this was certainly not intended in any way, shape, or form to be disrespectful to India. It's a blind spot that Biden had. Soros was a huge donor to the Biden campaign and then to Harris's. And so it was a really big thank you note.
All right, Michael, let me put that question to you because it's become a sore point. There are two sore points right now, okay, which a lot of people in India share. I certainly share them, right? One is the Americans openly, probably supporting, but definitely openly goading up until a few weeks ago Justin Trudeau. And I've never seen this happen between India and any Western power where we don't have a functioning consulate anymore. It's that bad, okay? That's not good news for associations when we are really having to take on China and other world threats. And we've seen a US prosecutor in New York filed charge sheets on cases of alleged corruption in India, whether it has locus standi or not. And most people would conclude that the person at the center of the charge sheet has got nothing to do with it. It's all directed at our prime minister. And those would be including the people operating in my country. these were both seen as very unusually hostile acts. Now, where has this left us in India and the United States Association?
Right, and you can add to that list U.S. policy in Bangladesh, which I know is something that also has caused concern.
Yeah, I was about to come to that next, because a person who's on the payroll of the Clintons suddenly becomes an undemocratic leader in Bangladesh. I'm going to come to that next, but you take on this thought first.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the many reasons why we can expect U.S.-India relations to be in a good place with Trump back as president. These concerns that have been expressed by many in India, including the ruling party, about this notion of a U.S. deep state acting in ways that malign India. It all ties into very similar ideas that Trump himself has put out there by the U.S. deep state. I mean, I think that the Indian ruling party and Donald Trump are very much see eye to eye on this issue of the deep state. And I think that someone like George Soros has has a worldview and politics that are completely unaligned, completely, about as different as one could get from those of Donald Trump. So, to answer your question, yeah, I think that these types of issues that did indeed affect the U.S.-India relationship, I wouldn't overstate the impact they had on them, but they affected it. I think this is something that will melt away. This is not going to be an issue with the Trump administration.
Okay.
And so, not to say there won't be some challenges in the relationship, there will be, but I do think that these concerns that have been expressed by New Delhi for quite some time about things that they thought were happening during the Biden era,
but
not going to see that as much.
I expect that. I expect that it will be different under Trump. But my curiosity would have been, why would an outgoing Biden administration in its last few months in power do this? And that's, of course, an open-ended question. So let me come to the thought then, Michael Kugelman, about what's happened in the region, what's happened in Bangladesh. There's an unelected government that is cozying up to Pakistan. Pakistan is everything that the Chinese wanted to be. It's a state that's it's not functioning well, and we are seeing massive Chinese buyouts of every infrastructure project there. What is going on?
Well, I mean, this is just a reflection of the consequences of the events of last summer, right? That when you had a prime minister, a long-serving prime minister, who was a very close friend of India's, perhaps its closest friend in the region, and when she left, that left a vacuum that was filled by actors that are not friendly to India, and in some cases are friendly to Pakistan, and indeed it has provided more space for Islamists. Now, we'd seen during the final phase of the Biden administration, the U.S. taking a position of essentially wanting to embrace the Yunus government and wanting to do everything possible to help stabilize the country, make it more prosperous, provide support for reforms. I don't think you're going to see that level of support from the Trump administration. I think that Donald Trump would see that type of posture from the U.S., providing support for so many things as a form of nation building, which is not something that he would want to do. So I think that this would be something that could have good consequences, positive consequences for both the U.S.-India relationship, because I think the U.S. and India will be back on the same page when it comes to Bangladesh, and also more broadly, I think that this would be a good thing for India, because it would see that the new government in the U.S. is essentially willing to look at Bangladesh in ways that India would like the U.S. to look at Bangladesh.
We are used to being in a hostile neighborhood, so there's no panic stations yet. But let me understand this, because it's really difficult to understand. Elizabeth Laris, I take it on good order that certain parts of the American establishment were upset with Sheikh Hasina even before the elections in Bangladesh took place, that it was on advisement, perhaps from New Delhi, that intervention did not happen then. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Americans have done it, but hey, who knows? But Sheikh Hasina travels to Beijing, she spends 10 days there, she comes back, and from a non-existential law and order situation, the law and order situation is so bad that she has to pack up her bags and run away. Now you have a non-elected, non-democratic establishment, and I see no one asking for elections in Bangladesh. How come?
To be honest, I haven't had too many conversations with people in Washington about that. I think that their attentions obviously have been focused elsewhere, and this is not an issue that they are taking on right now. I mean, that's the most honest answer I can give you.
Okay, so let me one last thought, and I want to get in before I get in one of the American former ambassadors joining us. Hugh Dugan is expected to join us in a minute. Professor Laris, now let's jump in on Elon Musk, okay? Because at the inaugural, we've seen the entry of Nigel Farage. Okay, he's known as hard right in the UK, if that's the word. Okay, we've seen Elon talking about politics that's taking place in Germany, that's taking place in France. Now I know Elon likes to talk and express his opinion on a lot of things, but is that just a person who's about to be a cabinet sort of official in the United States government expressing his personal point of view, or are we seeing that there is a preference of global leadership for this administration?
Oh, I mean, there certainly is a preference for, center-right governments. A lot of the governments in Europe until recently and Canada had leaned very much to the left, and they have really stumbled, particularly over the immigration issue. There it's, very legal immigration, particularly from North Africa, that has upset a lot of communities in Europe, and there's a backlash, and the backlash is being led by parties that are, labeled on the right. But one of the reasons they're on the right is because the governing parties are so much on the left. So, I mean, Trump likes Musk because the two of them are alike in that they both think outside the box. Like Trump came in 2016 saying, I'm going to drain the swamp. And he was very limited in doing that because he didn't have the control of Congress. Now he does, but you don't hear him referring to that anymore. But he really wants someone who's going to bring in a different way of doing things. It's a new day in America. He kind of said like the old, malaise is kind of gone, and we have new energy. And it's almost like Reagan's, 1984 campaign. It's morning in America again. Trump said America's decline is over. And he quote unquote in his inaugural speech said, I was sent by God. I was saved by God to make America great again. So he has a mission, and Musk is his partner.
Okay, yeah, and a very unapologetically religious ceremony. We've had 4 reverends. Trump invoked the name of God 3 times in his inaugural speech. So yeah, unapologetically religious, and so be it. It's a personal choice. I'll leave the last word with Andrea. Andrea, let me for people watching the broadcast. So, Andrea, I've been given to understand that you are, of course, seeking asylum, applying for Russian citizenship, right? At a time where, for a lot of people in the world, especially in the West, Russia is the enemy. What's your story?
So I applied for the Russian citizen after that the European Union start to spoke about the sanctions against me, do my work in Russia and in other countries of the multipolar world. I'm not the first journalist, the first reporter that has applied for the Russian citizenship because unfortunately now we are in a second Cold War, and the world is divided in 2 main groups, the West and the East. From my point of view, now with the new American administration, there is the possibility to normalize the situation, because till this moment, due to the Ukrainian conflict and the conflict in Middle East and the conflict between Iran and Israel, the world is going to a third world war. And Donald Trump said many times that he wants to stop this race.
Is there a second Cold War? For sure, it's already begun. I want to be careful before saying third world war, but unpleasant things are happening, and it's a lesson for all of those who try to talk about free speech. perhaps you want to read what's happened with Andrea from a different perspective, whether you agree, disagree, like it or not, or whether you agree or disagree with the Russians or not. Andrea, nonetheless, thanks for joining us. Professor Laris, Michael Kugelman, as always, pleasure to have you and your thoughts and perspective on the goings on. It's been a heck of a day. We take a very, very short break. We pick up this conversation live telecast on the other side. See you in a few seconds.